Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. The best thing for the United States is not a fight with China, which costs us too much in lost quality of life, considering the risk that we might lose because China is just too much bigger. And with the BRICS, it's unbelievable how much bigger they are. That size will eventually overwhelm us. So we should stop it now. We should change our policy and work out alive and let live agreement with China instead of confrontation. It's like we're saying, if we go in that direction, we'll be told that we had a chance in April of 2022 when we sat down in Istanbul and worked out most of a deal that would have ended the Ukraine war weeks after it began. We would have had a much better deal for Ukraine than what it's getting now. We lost that opportunity. This is becoming a familiar theme. We are starting on the same losing path in our struggle with China. Only it will be longer and more expensive with greater risks. We need to learn from Ukraine and not repeat the mistake. Right now in the United States, that position would have a huge number of supporters from all political sides. What I see is the steady decline of the American empire. It's in India's interest to get discounted oil because the Russians give them a very good price. They're just doing business. The Russians can't sell oil and gas in Europe because that was a European and American decision. They closed the market to bring Russia to its knees by cutting off its export markets. The Russians then turned to the Indians, with whom they already had long trading and military relations, and gave them a price they couldn't believe. And of course, the Indians said, "What do you want?" India isn't in Europe. India isn't interested in the fight between East and West over Ukraine. India is interested in developing its economy, which is the main demand of its people on the government, and getting cheap energy from Russia is a way to do that. I remember listening to the very capable foreign minister from India, who is very good looking incredulous at the journalists asking him why India was buying oil from Russia. He said, "You know the answer? Why did Germany buy oil from Russia? Why did Europe buy oil? What are you asking us? You want us to take sides in a war we had nothing to do with? Why? We aren't required to take sides in a war we had nothing to do with. You don't take sides in your country in wars you have nothing to do with." There are no good answers to these questions. There are no answers because of what's happening, which I think is why China and India are discovering they have many interests in common. They always did. India was a colony, China almost a colony, so they have a lot in common. Britain has been a problem for both of them, and they both know that they would be better off if they were less dependent on the West and more dependent on each other. Of course, they should expand exports and imports between them. They are the two biggest countries on this planet and desirable markets for each other. They should be developing their countries in a coordinated way because it will lead to faster growth for both of them, uh, rather than being focused on the West, which gets involved in their exchanges. They know this and talk about it. Economists I know at the university in New Delhi have debates about this. By the way, they have radical economists in a way that American universities don't allow. So they can actually have a variety of viewpoints. Americans celebrate diversity of thought, but don't have it. Indians don't make a big deal of it because they do have it. So they are able to build on different perspectives, many of which agree that their relationship with China must develop. And cheap energy from Russia makes that easier and faster, giving them a boost because India is becoming an important manufacturing country. India isn't where China is yet and won't be for a while, but it is becoming important. So it needs energy. It's a developing country and needs a lot of energy. Russia is in a position to provide it. The idea that India would sacrifice its own growth and development to please Britain and the West is ridiculous. The fact that a journalist would even think to ask that shows how lost those journalists are in their home country and the colonial mindset. It is pathetic. Of course, Mr. Besson can't understand the concept of a colony, so he won't apply that to his thinking. He will look at numbers like, gee, India is making a lot of money. He was fascinated with the 10% markup on weapons. And now he is fascinated with the fact that discounted Russian oil is making Indian families rich. Of course it is. But again, that is the least important part. For Mr. Besson, it's what he wants to talk about in the 30 seconds he has on national television. We're talking about a real mental, and just a side note, if Russia is accumulating rupees, the Indian currency from oil exports to India, you can be sure the Russian central bank is figuring out how to use those rupees to boost the production in India of goods that Russia would otherwise have to make itself, or worse, have to import from Western Europe or the United States. They won't have to. They can build on India. In other words, it allows the Brightshias to help each other by opening up channels for currency movements among them. So rupees go to Russia for oil, or, and then from Russia back to India for exports, or maybe not. Maybe the rupees will be accepted by the Chinese to pay for things they export to Russia because the Chinese know they can use them to buy who knows what from India, thereby rebuilding what made all the other currencies, including the dollar, become bigger than wherever they started. The Bryas are replacing America in the empire story, and it is a steady and much more powerful process than anything they can do in Azerbaijan or Venezuela or Syria. Those actions may look good and make a good headline here, and Michael is right about that. But it is not stopping the same way the Ukraine war did not stop all the things that led up to that war. The right processes are continuing. The war started, the war grew, and now the war is ending. And the other processes we've been talking about, they continue to advance. I'll start with Scott Besson. And all I can say is I'm sure his mother is very proud of him, but for the rest of us, not so much. I mean, it is embarrassing almost every time he speaks. It is embarrassing. I have no idea where he is coming from half the time. His loyalty to Mr. Trump is disgusting and pathetic, but besides that, I don't know what to say. To look at the deal between the United States and Europe and focus on the 10% markup on weapons is looking at a huge picture and focusing on one tiny unimportant detail. And that's what you want to talk about. You have to step back, and you are right. Nima, you are right to look at the different picture of the Europeans in relation to Mr. Trump then, and now because that is also Mr. Besson. What's important here is the subordination of Europe. This is the end of Europe. For 500 years since the Renaissance, Europe was the center of the world through its colonial takeover of the rest of the world, through its early development of capitalism, through its early industrialization, when it could be said it was in the lead. I don't know much about what was going on in China that many centuries ago, but for much of the world, this was the power, the center, the wealth. And now look at it. It's like a group of kindergarten children being taken by their teacher to the big man's building, the White House, where they are gathered in chairs to speak or to listen to the empty talk that comes from Mr. Trump. I know what they secretly think of him because they have said that in many interviews in their own countries. I follow some of those in France and Germany. I know what leaders, including those sitting there, have said about him, and there they are like puppies. For me, historically, that is the most important part. And I know we may not have time to talk about it today, but if you look at the trade agreement that has been reached between Mr. Trump and van der Leyen and the Europeans, the Americans will have imposed basically a 15% across the board tariff that all Europeans will have to submit to. And in exchange, the Europeans removed whatever tariffs they had so that the United States has virtually complete freedom. By the way, that's not enough to achieve much in terms of economics, especially in the short run, all. But it is enough to show that the colonial country has become the colony and the colony has become the colonizer. Britain and Europe are now minor players in a game directed by Mr. Trump and the United States. And the irony of it all is that the United States is doing that, as Michael correctly says, because the empire is in decline. They don't want to spend the money. They want to take advantage of those they control to put the costs of a declining empire on them. They have to agree to invest in the United States. They have to agree to buy liquid natural gas and other energy products from the United States. They have to open up their fishing and agriculture to American products, which is an important business, and so on. And so it's wonderful. You have to do all these things because we are running short of money. And the irony is that Mr. Besson knows that, and for someone like him, this is an achievement. And the way you see it is he focuses on the 10% markup, which shows he's just counting pennies. I find the humiliation in the history of Europe to be, and I believe, and I know my belief is partly based on hope. I understand that, but of course, let me remind everyone that's true of everyone else too. I'm just admitting it. My hope is that the European people will be disgusted by what they are watching and that you will see inside the European countries on the left and on the right a desire not to be dragged into this subordination. Let me remind everyone, including the Europeans, if the United States can do what it is now doing, why would you imagine that the next president will not do more of this? because you're telling the Americans, here's a way to ease your problems. Put them on us. How are the Europeans going to maintain their social welfare programs? Western Europe's welfare for its people is far ahead of what the United States does. They were able to afford that because they had no military expenses. The United States took care of that. It was a great arrangement to give a military economic boost to the United States, which needed it since we never got out of the Depression. World War II got us out, and the military budget has supported us ever since. So we took care of that for Europe so they could use the money they would have had to spend on the military to give their people health care, a free education, and all the other benefits they get that Americans don't know about, because it would be very difficult to get away with not giving it to Americans if they did. Now, what's going to happen in Europe now if they are not getting these benefits? If they have to pay all kinds of costs and make all kinds of adjustments, they are going to cut their welfare. They are already busy doing it. They are going to keep cutting their welfare. Well, here are two things. In Germany, as Michael, I believe, pointed out last week, the polling shows that the alternative for Germany now gets a higher polling result than the Christian Democratic Party, which used to be the dominant party in Germany, sometimes in partnership with the Social Democrats. But nowadays, the Social Democrats have mostly collapsed. So the alternative is the right wing saying, we don't want to be in this position. In France, it's the left wing. The right wing is there and is important. But the left wing is where the action is. The left wing is the largest faction in the parliament, and they have just declared, and I am following this very closely to keep up the show of American imperialism once the reality is no longer there. Their problem, which they know their problem is China and the Bry Sea. Those places are growing much faster than the United States is. They grew faster throughout the Ukraine war. I want to remind people China's economic growth per year is in the 5% range. American growth per year is half of that, if that. And India is even faster. Russia grew faster during the war than it had been growing before. It grew faster than any European country, including the United States. We are losing. We are losing everywhere. And many of these efforts, in fact, I would argue the Ukraine war itself are a demonstration that they can't do it. And I think that's a crisis for Europe that we aren't appreciating. All those people sitting around the desk that you just showed us of Mr. Trump in the Oval Office are the leaders who were born into and grew their entire careers as the allies of the United States. The subordinate allies, the ones who had been defeated in World War II, came out of it ruined if they were on the winning side, and ruined if they were on the losing side. The United States is the dominant power, and they are going to rebuild Europe as it's all over for them. They are desperate people, desperate in terms of their own careers, desperate in terms of their own worldview. They picked the wrong horse, and it's too late to get off. So they are going to ride him as long as he is still standing. They will continue the war in Ukraine forever if they have to. Look at them. That's how they talk. they don't see defeat. Russia keeps moving some number of kilometers to the west, and they don't see it. It is an extraordinary display of weakness, and the show around it shouldn't hide that. The idea that the way you organize production in a society is by the juxtaposition of employer and employee within the market framework from which you then create exploitation, the appropriation of surplus, its distribution, and a society built on that structure that has not yet, in my opinion, been fundamentally challenged, not by the People's Republic of China and not by the BRICS as a group. What they have challenged is the economic dominance of the West, of the United States, but of the G7, which is the United States, Canada, Japan, and Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. That is gone. I do not think we will ever see that again. And it marks the historic decline of Europe and the American offshoot of Europe. And that will play out in ways we haven't even begun to appreciate because we haven't seen it, or we don't yet know what we are seeing. But the fundamental part of that, with the condition that the employer employee structure, which is what I understand to be the core of capitalism, that remains to be challenged. And whether and how the BRICS do that is, at this point, in my view, an open question. If I understand Professor Patnaik correctly, if there is no fundamental challenge to the employer-employee relationship, to what for me is the core class structure of capitalism, then it isn't so surprising that in the political system, you also get decision making made by a very small group of people at the top of these societies, often involving huge social risk to the majority of the population, including dying from bombing and warfare and all the rest of it. And yet, that's the basis of the international system, and the BRICS don't seem to change that much. It changes who plays the role, and the desire for inclusion is the statement by the elites in the BRICS countries that they no longer be subordinate to those in the West. And I agree that's a huge step that is important in many ways we haven't yet seen. But I see a link there. If you don't challenge the organization of production, a small group of people, the board of directors, if it's a corporation and the owner of the business, the person who started it, it doesn't really matter. A small group of people who make the decisions about what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output, which the majority of people have to help produce, but are then excluded from those key decisions. And then you repeat that in the political system, including the international system, and they reinforce each other at that level of basic theory and basic thinking that Professor Patnaik was pointing to. And I think that's correct. And my hope is that the enormity of the change of the BRICS will encourage those caught up in it by seeing what can be changed that they might have thought couldn't be, that they will now go on and be ambitious in what else needs to be changed to finally break, not just from the dominance of one, but from the dominance of any. But I see here in the United States a result of the rise of the BRICS. It's a result of many things, but among them, an important influence is the rise of the BRICS. So I am in a position of telling you that the ability to question capitalism as a system has never been greater in the United States in my lifetime than it is right now. That is the audience of our people here for the idea that the economic problems of the United States are exactly as I think Professor Patnaik wants us to see, that the audience in the United States is now more open to that level of criticism than it has ever been, is aware in the beginnings of a consciousness, and that's all we have, the beginning of a consciousness of the decline of the American empire. The awareness that that's what's going on is having the effect, at least for the moment, of allowing, of opening the space here for the critique at the foundation of the whole capital worker relationship, that that's not an acceptable way to organize a society, and that a truly more democratic participation of the majority of people at all levels of economic decision making is the alternative that interests people. I am surprised that I can say that to you at this point, but I can. I'm overjoyed by it. I don't deny it for a minute, but there is a process, at least here, in which the rise of the People's Republic of China, the rise of the Bereichs, on and the effect it has on limiting the dominant power's ability to do what it wants, and that we see it as a nation more and more has opened the space to do exactly what Professor Patnaik wishes to see more of, as I do too. But it is happening here. I cannot tell you if it will survive. I cannot tell you if it will last and spread, but for the moment, it's extraordinary. I can give an example. I am in touch with people from a number of African countries. And in those African countries, I have noticed over recent years that the existence of the Braies and of China, and this is in countries that have not yet joined or publicly said they wish to, but I can tell the kind of people I know, people on the left, etc., that it does exactly what Professor Patnaik said. It opens the space for them now to push within their countries with their political parties and their leadership a way to say there is a different path that you could be following. You keep sending missions to London and New York to get advice and money and to make deals for the development of this country here in Africa. But you could explore a different path if you were to send the mission instead to New Delhi or to Beijing or Sao Paulo, because you would get not only a different set of possible paths forward, but now you can get the funding that you used to think was only available in the West, and you can see export markets, maybe here if you got this investment, and the Chinese in particular are repeatedly willing to make such arrangements. It is changing the politics inside African countries. And my guess is more broadly than that, part of the reason I think we are talking about the Braies is that they are a part of what is opening everything up, with all the conditions and the criticisms which are appropriate and should be directed at the Braies. No question, their diversity, their willingness to accept most of the rules of the game, their lack of interest in fundamental criticisms of the existing economic system, all of that, but it is a factor that opens things up. Let me give you a couple of others. Yes, the universities are doing in the West what they have always done. But then again, two things. One, I am a product of Western universities. I am, in fact, a a product of the elite ones here in this country that I went to school at where I was taught. Half of my professors are Nobel Prize winning economists. They tried very hard to persuade all of us that capitalism was the ultimate achievement of the human race. And they failed, and not just with me, they failed. There's a consistent number of us for whom this did not work. Well, I still teach. I still teach at the New School University in New York City that you may know of, which is a little bit different university, but in the end, not fundamentally different at all. Now, in this situation, I've noticed the following. My students in huge numbers are deeply upset by what is going on in Gaza, deeply upset by the Israeli behavior since October of 23, and are questioning not only Israel, but are questioning the United States as the basic sole supporter of Israel and trying to understand what it means. And this is as true of Jewish students as of non-Jewish students. Um, and the attempt of the government under both Biden and Trump to destroy, to crush, to arrest, to imprison people, deporting them, and so on, in order to keep the opposition down, and yet a poll which indicates the majority of Americans do not support Israel. This has the same effect. Let me be a little bold. I think that these and other aspects of the decline of the American empire are coming together to open an ever wider space and an ever deeper foundation for times of criticisms that Professor Patnaik and have been spending a lifetime trying to develop and to share our relative communities. And so you get from me an optimism that I have not felt before and that has been slow to emerge, but is now a very strong sense of what is going on. For the first time in my life as an academic here in the United States, the debate among my colleagues has shifted. The age-old debate, which is the unspeakably boring conversation about whether a little more government or a little less government is a good or a bad thing, whether you should be a Keynesian or a neoclassical, as if that were what we ought to be debating, is looking as useless and strange and off the mark as it always was. And when I introduce, we could be discussing a hierarchically organized production system, capitalism, with a horizontally organized worker cooperative alternative organization of production, they all look at me and say, well, hasn't that been debated? And I smile and I allow a moment to pass. And then I say to them, um, never in my education did any professor, with one exception. When I was a student of Paul Sweezy in Stanford many years ago, he introduced that question during the semester, but never before and never since in all the elite universities I spent my life did anybody think this was an interesting question. Now I have opportunities to make that the interesting question on a scale I've never seen before. And I think that is in part thanks to China and the BRICS. And I want to recognize